Hello and welcome back to another episode of Low Spec Labs. Before we get started, I would like to stop and say thank you. Thank you to everyone who has commented, thank you to everyone who has liked these videos, and thank you to everyone who has subscribed. If you're new to the channel and would like to keep receiving IT and automotive content, please go ahead and subscribe. Otherwise, let's get started. In this video, we are covering Chapter 24 of Sander Van Voigt's RHCSA EX200 version 9. How to manage NFS. What is NFS? You might have seen my shorts explaining this concept, but let's go over it one more time. Repetition leads to understanding. NFS, or Network File System, is a protocol that allows you to remotely mount files and folders on a different Linux system to your local Linux system. NFS was first invented in 1984 and has been through several revisions. The most current version is NFS v4, and that's the version that ships with RHEL9. How do you actually manage NFS? Let's find out together. So there are 4 steps you're going to have to follow in order to create your NFS share. The first is you create a local directory you want to share. The second step is editing etc exports. That is the file that is going to let you actually define the NFS share. The third is to actually start the NFS service. So you actually have to start the program to share NFS. And then last, you have to add firewall rules to allow NFS traffic into your server. So let's walk through that process. We're currently logged into server 1. The very first thing you should do before configuring NFS is to verify if it's installed. So let's do a systemctl status NFS. So you can see it can't be found. Okay, we tried with NFSD as well, and it says unit file is not there. So how do we resolve this? We can resolve that issue by installing NFS. How do you install NFS? Well, it's straightforward. You do DNF install -y NFS utils. And then you go ahead and you let that command run. It'll take a few minutes for it to process. NFS is done installing. Let's go ahead and finish our configuration. Let's start by making some directories. We can do a make dir -p /NFS data /user1 /user2. Cool. Now we run an ls-alh on our root. You'll see we have a couple folders here. We have NFS data, user1 and user2 down here. So let's go ahead and copy some stuff to the folder we just created. We can do cp/etc a to d star because we wanted to match everything inside of there. And then we want to copy that to NFS data, right? And you'll notice it copied the files but not the folders. So let's do an ls/NFS data. As you can see, we got some configuration files in there now. Now we're at the second stage of configuring NFS, which is for us to edit our etc exports file. How do you edit your NFS config file? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We do nano/etc exports. And there we go. We end up with an empty file. After that, we then have to define our share. So to define our share, we first type in the path of the share. So it's root NFS data. Then after that, we have to define our mount options. So you type in the path, give it 4 spaces. Because we want this to include all mount options, we hit star. And then because we want the clients that connect to this to be able to read and write to that file, we put in read write. And then we might want the root account to be able to make write to that folder. So we do no root squash. Then we can repeat the same thing for our other folders like user1 and user2. And there we go. We now have our NFS config file configured. Then after that, we start the NFS server or restart it if we already have it running. We do systemctl restart NFS server. And as long as it throws no error messages, that means it was successful. Now it's time for the last step, which is adding the right firewall rules. How do you add the NFS service to the firewall? Let's find out. First you do firewall cmd dash dash add services, and then we do NFS, and then we do dash dash permanent. And there we go, we've now added the NFS service to the firewall. But wait, there's more. We still have two more rules to add. The first rule is for RPC bind, which is the service that lets NFS shares bind locally. And then the other one is for mount D, which is what lets the remote client mount the NFS share. So let's do that again. Then let's do RPC bind permanent. And let's do it one more time for mount D. So mount dash dash permanent. And with those rules added, we then have to reload the firewall. So we do firewall cmd dash dash reload. And there we go. And with that, we should now be able to hop onto our NFS client and mount the NFS server. The next part in this series is to actually mount the NFS share from the client. So how do you mount an NFS share? First, we start with installing NFS utils on our client. So we can run a dnf install -y NFS utils. And there we go. We just got NFS installed on our client. Then we have to list the available mounts on our NFS server. To do that, we do show mount -e, and then we point it to our NFS server, which is at 192.168.2.120. And as you can see, it lists the available shared NFS shoulders on that server right here. So what if we wanted to mount the NFS data share? To do that is pretty straightforward. We do mount, then type in the server's host name or IP address. We do colon, and then we point it to our share, which is NFS data. And then we point it to the local directory, which is going to be mount. We've mounted that NFS share. How do we confirm it's mounted? We'll use the mount command again, and this time we grep it and we look for the IP of our server, which is at 2.120. As you can see, it shows that we now have this network share mounted. It tells us where the network share is mounted from, right? It tells us the folder it's mounted on. It tells us the type, and then it tells us our mount option right here. So we know how to manually mount NFS shares, but there's a problem. If you were to reboot your server, you'd have to go in and manually run the mount command again to remount that NFS share. This is very tedious and annoying. Thankfully, there's a solution for that, and that is automatically remounting your NFS shares. So how do we auto mount NFS shares? There are two ways. The first is your RHCSA tab, which we can define our NFS mounts in. Another option is you can configure a utility known as auto mount to automatically mount the NFS share. Let's walk through these two together. When you're auto mounting NFS shares, you'll want to edit the RHCSA tab on your NFS server. To do that, you do nano RHCSA tab. We're going to go ahead and enter the configuration to automatically mount our NFS share, and then I'll break that down for you. So defining a mount in the RHCSA tab is pretty straightforward. First, we type in the IP of the NFS server. So that's 2.120. Then we type in the share. Then we type in the local folder it's going to be mounted to. Make sure you follow the spacing conventions inside of RHCSA tab. So we start with our mount here. We do a bunch of spaces until we get over here. And then we type in the protocol type for the mount. Then we type in sync. Then we type in 00 and we hit save. And that's how you edit your RHCSA tab. So let's go ahead and break this line down some more. Looking at this RHCSA tab option, let's break it down. This is the first part right here. Right, so this defines our server and our mount. So this is our server, and then this is the mount. And notice we use the colon right here to separate those two. Then we have the mount portion right here, right? So this is the local folder we're going to be mounting to. We then have the third portion right here, which defines the file system type. This is the fourth option. The fourth option right here. This option defines whether or not we're going to back up this folder when we're running backups. So this, which says run a FS check or a file system check on mount. So, and there we go. So with that explanation over, we can go back to our terminal and we'll go ahead and save. There we go. We will now automatically mount the NFS share when our system reboots. So we know how to mount automatically using HCFS tab, but there is another utility we can use to automatically mount file systems, and that is AutoFS. So how do you configure AutoFS? To configure AutoFS, you have to configure two files. The first file is at etc auto.master, and that is where we define our AutoFS config files. The second file is at etc auto whatever you name your mount file. You'll see what I'm talking about in the practical example. So let's just start with that. We have our NFS client pulled up here. So the first thing we want to do is nano etc auto. The file doesn't exist. So because the file doesn't exist, that means AutoFS is not installed. So how do you install AutoFS? We do dnf install -y AutoFS, and we let that run for a second. Now that AutoFS is installed, we can go ahead and edit its config file. So to do that, we do nano/etc auto.master. Then we scroll down to the end of the page to do our entry. To define a entry in AutoFS, first we put the mount, right? So in our case, that is mount. And then we put in the name of the config file. So we're going to call this auto.nfsdata. And then we save. After that, we have to create a file in etc called auto.nfsdata. And there we go. We now have a second file. So to define our new mount, we're going to type in files. Then we define our options, which is read write. Then we point it to the share at 192.168.2.120/NFS Then after that, we can do a systemctl restart AutoFS. And there we go. Now if we were to reboot our computer, it would automatically remount the NFS share. The reason we want to do it like this is because it kind of splits the configurations up. If we wanted to go back in and change that config, we could. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen, or shall I say lady and gentlemen. Female audience participation is at 1%. This is 99% sausages, boys. Can you believe that? It's a sausage party, right? Thank you for tuning in. Please look forward to chapter 25, which is about managing the TimeD service. We are almost done. We have 2 more chapters to go, and then we're done with this series. And then we can finally start some Ansible and some Azure stuff. So looking forward to that. I appreciate all your support, all your comments, and you subscribing. Have a great day, guys.